Joseph Abbeel's memoir offers a riveting glimpse into the life of a Flemish horseman conscripted into Napoleon's Grand Army. This is the 12th episode. We find Abbeel in the hands of Cossacks again. Let's begin. After sitting for some time in the guardhouse, one of the members of the civilian guard took me to General Tettenborn. He interrogated me in 3 languages and had me searched, as he thought I was a spy. Fortunately, I had thrown away my cockade and my false passport the day before. Eventually, the general judged that I was innocent and sent me to the poorhouse, which stands outside the Altona gate. When I arrived at that hospital, all the men gathered around me. One said this, another that. I stood there like Jesus among the Jews. Then I was led through a large long hall, which housed more than 300 old women. They all jumped up, clapped their hands, and shouted, "There's one of those scoundrels who helped ruin everything." Then I was taken back to the courtyard. A brother from the hospital called me and took me to a small room, where I had to undress to the skin. He took my clothes away and gave me an old pair of shorts that came only to the knees and which I had to button at the bottom of my stomach. He also gave me a vest, decorated with large buttons, that came only halfway down my backside. Both garments were patched with 100 or more pieces of cloth in different colors, and with them, I could walk around the courtyard like a clown. I had a good life, but I didn't realize it. In the evening, I was given a bed full of bedbugs and other vermin. Every 24 hours, we received a quarter of black bread and a spoonful of mashed potatoes, without salt or fat. I walked around all day crazed with hunger. After a few days, I wrote a letter to the general requesting to be placed with the other prisoners, who had arrived in the city while I was in the hospital. The general had me brought in, and I was taken to the whorehouse, a prison by the water, also outside the Altona gate. There, I was placed with 6 others in a small cell and very well guarded. Among them were a Dutchman, 3 Flemings, and a Croat who had married in Hamburg and who still had money. The Croat had a bottle of schnapps brought in, which we drank together. Meanwhile, the Croat's wife came to talk quietly with him and then left. We talked and laughed, for the schnapps made us forget the misery, although we were not drunk. In the evening, I asked the Croat for his knife to cut a piece of bread. He gave it to me, and after I had cut a piece of bread, I gave it back to him. Then we laid down on the wooden bunks to sleep. Around midnight, I was awakened by noise. I jumped off my bunk and called the others, who also woke up and immediately stood up, except for the Croat who remained lying down. Because it was dark and we couldn't see anything, we thought he had epilepsy and called the guards to bring light. They came upstairs with a candle, thinking we wanted to break out. When they entered the room, we saw blood running from the wooden bunk. One of the guards jumped on the bed, grabbed the Croat by the hair, and sat him upright. Only then did we see that he had cut his wrists and throat. The guard shouted that we had murdered him and took us to another cell. We could not sleep any more that night. The next morning, around 10 o'clock, officers came to us asking if we wanted to enlist. The other 4 did so. I was left alone. In the evening, I was put back in the cell where the accident had happened. The body had been removed, but the blood was still there. That night, I slept very soundly, without thinking about anything. The next day, around 8 o'clock in the morning, an officer from the guard came into my prison cell. He asked me why I was sitting there all alone and from which country I came. I told him what had happened during the night and added that it was a very unfortunate and sad affair for me to be locked up there all alone. As soon as he understood that I was Flemish, he ordered the jailer to move me to another cell. Almost immediately, the door was opened, and I was taken to another room, where 2 customs officers were sitting. One of them had been sick for some time and therefore still had a lot of bread left. 2 or 3 hours later, I heard noise outside. I looked through the window and saw that a detachment of imprisoned gendarmes was being brought into the prison. They were captured on the other side of the Elbe and locked up in a dungeon below our residence. As soon as their escort had left, I called out to them and asked if there were any Flemings among them. They answered yes. One of them came from Sint Niklaas and another from Ghent. When they heard that I also came from that region, they immediately came to the window to talk to me, although we could not see each other. After spending the day in that way, I lay down on the straw sack at nightfall. Because I hadn't slept the previous night, I soon fell into a deep sleep. I slept until about 12 o'clock at night. Then I heard someone knock 3 times on the door of my cell. The knocking was followed by a ghastly voice that repeated 3 times, "Frenchman, get up, get up, get up and come downstairs." At the same moment, the door was opened. Since I was not fully awake yet, I saw no one standing there. Hastily, I put on my trousers. Because I heard noise in the courtyard, I immediately went to the window to see what was going on. I saw more than 300 armed men standing there talking to each other. While I was at the window, I heard one of them ask another if all the prisoners would get a bullet through the head. No, the other answered, only the soldiers who did not want to enlist in our legions will be shot through the head. The gendarmes and customs officers will be hanged because they have plucked and tormented too many people in the region. And, he added, yesterday I helped set up the gallows to hang these scoundrels on. When I had heard and understood all this, I hurriedly put on the few clothes I had. I wanted to be the first to go downstairs, thinking I might still have a chance to escape. However, I couldn't help telling the gendarmes what I had learned. I also told my 2 sleeping companions, for they had not understood anything because they did not speak German. When I wanted to go downstairs, the sick customs officer told me that I could take the 4 or 5 soldiers' loaves of bread he still had, as they might come in handy. I didn't need to be told twice. I took the loaves under my arms and walked down the stairs. But before I was downstairs, I met one of the guards who was running upstairs to urge the others to hurry. He looked at the bread and asked me what I was going to do with it, since, as he said, I wouldn't be alive for another hour. I replied that it was none of his business, and that before I died, I wanted to satisfy my appetite one last time, and I continued my way downstairs. In the courtyard, the villains formed a kind of wall or hedge around me. And so I stood in their midst on display like a dog that had stolen prey. I had no hope of escaping. Meanwhile, the gendarmes and customs officers also came downstairs. We were lined up in 3 rows and led to the city. We walked until about 6 o'clock in the morning, without stopping anywhere, in and out of the streets, regularly receiving kicks and punches from our escorts. Eventually, we were driven into the courtyard of a large building. We immediately looked around to see where the gallows were. Since none were in sight, we thought they were set up in another walled courtyard nearby. While we were waiting, we told each other that the walled square was probably the execution site, but that we would not enlist with those scoundrels anyway. After we had been standing there for a long time, one of our bodyguards came running with a letter in his hand, which he handed to the commander of our guards. He read the letter, said that a counter order had come, and immediately had us locked up in a nearby prison. After about an hour, we were ordered to come out again. This made us very afraid, for we all thought that we would definitely be executed now. Outside, we were lined up in 3 rows again. We were not allowed to leave those rows until we were ordered to do so. This made us very suspicious. After standing there for about an hour, we saw the city commander approaching with a large entourage. When he was near us, he asked if we were still not planning to leave our old master and join him. After we all refused, he said he would let us rot in the prison cells until we had come to our senses. We were immediately divided between 2 prisons. When the commander had left, we told each other that they would undoubtedly let us starve to death there. But it turned out quite differently than we thought, for around noon we received good soup, bread, beer and straw sacks to sleep on. This gave us new courage. We told each other that they were undoubtedly afraid that the French would retake the city, for we knew that our army was not far away. In those circumstances, we spent about a month in those prisons. Every day we expected to be liberated by our troops, for from the prisoners of war who were brought in daily, mostly customs officers and gendarmes, we learned that our army was approaching the city every day. But alas, all our hopes were eventually dashed, for more and more prisoners arrived. The citizens of the city treated them so harshly that we could hear them coming when they were still half an hour away, due to their screams and lamentations. These unfortunate souls were completely at the mercy of the mob and were pushed by the citizens in groups from the bridge into the Elbe, as we learned from others. The remaining prisoners received so many kicks and blows that they barely reached the prison. The cruelty was so great that we often closed our windows, fearing that the mob would enter the building through the windows to murder us. After spending a month there, full of fear for our lives, we left at the beginning of May. We were about 1,000 prisoners of war and were escorted by 12 Cossacks. A few days later, the city of Hamburg was retaken by the French, but before I write about this new journey, it seems not inappropriate to give a small explanation of what has happened since the burning of Moscow. As soon as this beautiful, large, and rich city was almost completely reduced to ashes, our great wealth turned into poverty, for the food supplies that had been brought in abundance from the city to our campsite were consumed in a few days, while afterward we had no possibility to obtain new food supplies. A Russian army corps that had come from Turkey had completely surrounded us, so that we could not venture even a quarter of an hour's walk outside the camp without great danger of being taken prisoner or murdered. And, worse still, the cold became so severe that it was unbearable. Hoping to leave this unfortunate place soon, we burned the wood of our barracks to warm ourselves. As a result, we eventually had nothing left that offered us any protection against the cold and the snow. That snow fell so abundantly that we were often covered with a layer of 2 to 3 feet thick in the mornings. It was a peculiar sight as we all crawled out from under it, all as white as doves. From the army that lay in the vicinity, we saw more than half die of hunger in a few days, for even if one had wanted to pay 2 louis d'or for a pound of bread, there was no bread to be had. The remaining half of the army became smaller day by day due to the severe frost, forcing us to choose the rabbit's path. Everyone sought a way out to get out of that accursed region as quickly as possible. We left behind everything we still had, that is to say, weapons, horses, and various pieces of artillery. And so we walked in disorder towards our homeland, with dripping noses, hands under the armpits, some almost naked, others dressed in a sheepskin, some barefoot, others with one foot in a shoe and the other foot wrapped in a rag, most wounded and all black from hunger and cold. In short, we were emaciated by misery and hardly looked like humans anymore. Up to our bellies, we walked through the snow, heading for our homeland from which we were then still 600 to 700 hours walk away. When we finally reached the main road from Moscow to Königsberg, cities about 400 miles apart, we could not walk a quarter of an hour without finding dead bodies, which were already covered by the snow. These graves were easy to recognize because the snow had formed little mounds at those places. In other places, we saw many dying people lying around, who, even though they were not yet dead, had been completely stripped by their traveling companions. Yes, the humanity that had always prevailed in the French army had been banished from the hearts of the French, so that one brother would have murdered another for his clothes or a piece of bread. It went so far that 2 good friends who traveled together treated each other as follows. One of them had the misfortune to fall, whereupon the other immediately jumped on top of him and stripped him down to his skin. The other then continued his way to suffer the same fate a little further on. While they witnessed these and other atrocities, too many and too terrible to describe here, the survivors continued on the road from Moscow to Königsberg. On an evening when it was colder than usual and it was impossible to spend the night outdoors, I arrived at a place where 2 large barns stood, still completely intact. I wanted to spend the night there, but unfortunately, they were already bursting full of wounded soldiers. To warm themselves, they had crawled completely, up to their ears, into the straw. There were at least 200 or 300 men. One could not drop a pin without hitting someone. When I saw this, I started to make a small fire with others who were still arriving, outside on the threshing floor. Soon, several fires were lit. Because it was windy, some sparks landed on the straw and in a moment, the 2 barns were ablaze. The men inside all wanted to flee first, but in the tumult, the doors became blocked, so everyone still inside was trapped. Nonetheless, it did us good to warm ourselves by the fire, and we had fun when we heard the cartridges that the unfortunate ones in the burning barn still had with them exploding. The next morning, we left without talking about what had happened. The only thing we said to each other about it was that the burned soldiers were better off than we were. Further, our thoughts did not go. After a period of 6 months, during which I always slept outdoors, I finally reached Königsberg, as I mentioned earlier. A short time later, the French army also arrived there. That army had already lost 990 cannons, 49 generals, and more than half of its men, as was said there. But to keep it short, we will leave the army here and I will continue with my journey from Hamburg. This concludes the 12th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Abbeel's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.